Hello and welcome to another edition of Happy Hour Live. What's going on? It is Styles. Thanks for tuning in and checking out this edition of our live video chats. Today we've got Paul Fishbein with me, who is the producer of two documentary series. One that's out right now, another that is on the way. The first one is Time Warp, the greatest cult films of all time. That is out now via VOD, all three parts. His next one coming up is Skin, a history of nudity in film. That's coming up on August 18th. We're going to talk to Paul right now about both those projects. So let's bring him on to the show right now. Paul, thank you for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. Let's start off with Time Warp. All three parts are out now. The last time you and I spoke was on the phone, and it was right as part one was coming out. Now that all three are out, what's kind of been the reaction that you've seen from those that have watched all three?
Well, it's pretty critically acclaimed. We didn't get a ton of mainstream reviews, but I think out of about 24, 25 reviews, all but two were very positive. And from people who have seen it, they seem to love it. I mean, this series was designed for film buffs, and if you're a film buff, you're going to love it because it's just loaded with tons of stars and tons of directors and tons of great behind-the-scenes stories as you go through the history of cult movies. And so people who have seen it seem to love it. So what can I tell you?
I really love it. I mean, for starting with part one that was Midnight Madness into horror and sci-fi part two. Part three I just recently wrapped up when I reached out to you about doing this. And part three was a lot of fun because comedy and camp. You got Office Space, Fast Times, you got Showgirls in there. There's a lot of great films covered in part three. So let's talk about those right there because for me, like Office Space, seeing the excitement in the faces of those you interviewed from the film all these years later, still for them to talk about that film is pretty amazing.
Well, Office Space is one of the quintessential cult movies of the home video era, because it was an utter failure at the box office, but we were past the repertory cinema. You know, there's only a few left, few and far between. And it caught on home video, on DVD, and really, really created a huge hit long after it left the theaters. And if you remember in the feature, Mike Judge talks about going to Blockbuster Video and seeing people renting it and following them to the counter and making sure that they were actually renting Office Space. And I think Office Space resonates with people because we all work. And many of us have worked in offices. So it's so real. It's so in your face. It's so true. That I think that's why it has all that repeatability. People just watch it over and over again.
Oh, absolutely. To this day, it's one of my all-time favorite comedies. Still in my head, that scene of the printer getting smashed out in the field. I mean, they even made Funko Pop figures of it. So that tells you its historical appreciation and reference to fans.
Yeah, for sure. It's great. It was great. We had Ron Livingston. We had like I think most of the main cast actually. So it was really great. So.
Yeah, again, seeing all their happy faces talking about that. Looking back at all the films you chose for this, because it's over three parts. There's a lot to cover, but in terms of cult film, there are so many. So how'd you whittle it down to these three parts? And I would say what, like 50 films maybe made the cut?
Yeah, about 50.
Okay.
Well, it was a long process. So we started out with a list of probably 250 what we thought were legitimate cult films. And they were culled from Danny Wolf, the director, and Christine Augustin, one of our producers, and people that we knew. And of course, the Danny Peary cult film books, which are the essential cult film Bibles. And we kind of got ourselves down to like 250. And then we picked about 10 or 12 that we said have to be no matter what. I mean, you can't do it without Rocky Horror Picture Show. You can't do it without Pink Flamingos. You can't do something like this without Harold and Maude or Eraserhead. I mean, these are the essential cult films. So once we had picked those, then we set out to see who we could talk to. How many people could we get? Directors, producers, writers, stars of the movies. And a lot of why we included certain movies and didn't include other movies was simply because you could get the people and they were willing to come on and talk about it. So one of my favorite interviews is Jeff Goldblum, and he was there for The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. Now, Buckaroo Banzai is a cult film, but it's sort of on the edge, and had we not been able to get Jeff Goldblum, we might have replaced it with something else. One example of not getting the stars, but still having to put the movie in as Harold and Maude, because Bud Cort decided Harold and Maude is not a cult film and was offended that we called it a cult film, and said he will not discuss it with us because it's a classic film. And we said, Bud, it is a classic film, but it's also a cult film. But it had to be included, so we had other people talk about it. But I think most of it fell into place. And, you know, I think except for maybe 2 or 3 films that probably should have been in there, I don't think there's anybody's arguing with what we left out.
Okay. You mentioned Jeff Goldblum there. Talk to me about the $15 or the $1,500 haircut to get him to do this thing with you. I hear there's a story behind this.
So some people get paid for their interviews, and some people, you know, the bigger stars don't ask. So Jeff Goldblum agreed to do it, but they said we had to pay for his stylist for the day. So what is a stylist? You know, hair and makeup. The stylist is going to do, they're going to do his hair for that day. They're going to meet him at Jeff's house, and then he's going to accompany him to the set. So I said, how much is the hairstylist for the day? They said $1,500. So you still want Jeff Goldblum. It busts your budget a little bit, but we paid the stylist. So Jeff Goldblum came to set. He was unbelievable. I mean, he was worth it. I mean, he's one of the most engaging people, and he's everything that you expect him to be. He didn't disappoint at all, and he was talking nonstop stories and everything. And then at the very end, we asked the last question, and he goes, "Oh, okay, good. We done? Did you get everything you need?" And then he comes over to me. He goes, "I hope you got what you needed." He goes, "I hope I was good." And I went, "Yeah." He goes, "Either way, I do have a great haircut." So that was his acknowledgement, you know. No, I'm sorry. He said, "Either way, my hair looks good." Something like that, you know.
He got a great new cut out of it.
He was worth it, though. So, you know, Jeff Goldblum sat down in the green room with his hairstylist. Danny Wolf, our director, went in to talk to him. They started to talk about cult films, and we're just talking back and forth, nonstop talking. And we went and got him. They walked to set together. They were still talking about cult films. He sat in the chair. My sound guy put the lav on him. They were still just talking about cult films, and we just started running tape. And Danny didn't ask his first question until like 20 minutes in. They were just riffing on cult movies. So that's how he is. He's just one long soundbite, you know?
Wow. I can only imagine the B-roll that you have of him that could be used for bonus material.
We have an hour of nonstop Jeff Goldblum sound bites.
Could we ever see these 3 films put out in a package with bonus material?
Well, we're talking to the distributor about maybe a Blu-ray box set sometime in the future. The movies are all out now on video on demand. You can get them on, Apple TV or iTunes or Amazon or Vudu, wherever you rent movies. But in a few weeks or maybe a month or two, we're going to re-release them as a package.
Okay.
So if you want to own them, it'll be a discounted price for all 3.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Time Warp, the greatest cult films of all time, out now again, as Paul just said, on VOD. Kingpin's mentioned in the portion of comedy and camp, and I thought it was interesting because Peter Farrelly, he's known for so many great films, but this one was not that, in terms of box office, not that great.
Right.
So
Peter Farrelly could not have been happier that we picked Kingpin, because he says all anybody wants to talk to him about is there's something about Mary. Mm-hmm. And obviously he's been, and we actually interviewed him right before Green Book came out, and we asked him what he was working on, and he said, "Oh, just this little Southern road film." He goes, "It's just a little film." It was Green Book, but he was so excited that we were there to talk about Kingpin, because obviously he has many more popular movies, Dumb and Dumber and Something About Mary, and yet he was so thrilled that we like Kingpin. And the truth of the matter is, Kingpin is a little bit of an underground cult film, but everybody who sees it loves it. I mean, people see Kingpin and it's like, oh my, I can't believe I didn't see that. And so it sort of has a nice little reputation going. And he was thrilled. I mean, he was so happy we included it.
It is such a great film. Best in Show also featured in comedy and camp. Of course, we lost Fred Willard this year, and he's in the documentary. What was it like speaking with him?
It was great. We went to his house in Encino for the day. He was gracious as can be. He's a beautiful house, furnished, and he was also funny and on the whole time. He didn't seem sick. He seemed like himself. And he was exactly like you see him in the movies or on TV. Same personality, just going, ad-libbing. And he was having a lot of fun. And he remembered all his ad-libs from the movie. He kept repeating them over and over again. So he was great. And I was excruciatingly sad that he died. You know, we have a little bit of a curse going in that we interviewed a bunch of people who died right before the movie came out. So we did the last interview with Tobe Hooper, the director of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Mm-hmm. We did the last interview with Sid Haig, star of Devil's Rejects. Yep. We got Stuart Gordon's probable last interview. He's the director of Reanimator. And then, of course, Fred Willard died, and we feel like we've cursed people. And, by the way, in the next thing we're going to talk about, the nudity documentary, Sylvia Miles, who was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Midnight Cowboy. We interviewed her, and she passed away. So we're a little bit of a curse. It's very sad. It's very sad. It really is.
That is very, very sad indeed. We'll wrap up with the whole part here at Time Warp. I want to ask real quick, with the age of streaming now and cult film, how has that changed the idea and the perception of a cult film? Because back in the day, I used to, a younger me would go to a midnight screening or maybe go to a Blockbuster, the local home rental video store, to find what might not be a mainstream film, find it, rent it, and there you go. It becomes a cult film. What about now?
Well, I grew up, I'm older than you. I grew up when there was no home video and barely any cable TV. So, there were repertory cinemas, like here in LA, we have the New Beverly. There were thousands of them all over the country. So they would play older movies or classic movies. And that's where the cult films, either on a midnight screening or just a regular screening, the cult films would find their audience. And it was usually word of mouth, find the audience, slow build over a long period of time, and then it becomes a cult film. Now, because of streaming and home video and the quickness that movies go from theater to home, it's harder for something to become a cult film. So, the most recent example, and it's probably like 17 years now since it came out, is The Room, where it had a very slow build. It was a bomb. They kept showing it at midnight. He was four-walling it at midnight. He was paying for the screenings. And eventually it caught on like wildfire. And that was sort of like the last time that became like a Rocky Horror. And people, participate and throw things at the screen, just like with Rocky Horror. So in today's world, it's really hard. One of the cult films that is in our horror and sci-fi volume is the Human Centipede. And that's an example of a streaming era cult film in that it came out, it was kind of a bomb, and then just through like VOD and Netflix, it kind of caught on, and it was this sort of retro, disgusting, kind of gross out fest that I don't even want to describe on the air here, but it's horribly disgusting and so much a cult film now that it feels like it was put out in the 70s. But it's very hard for a movie to become a cult film today because everything is available to everybody all the time. So that's probably why 2003 is the last year of a release of a cult film for us. Yeah.
You talk about characters there. Tom Six, you interview him. Was he almost in character the whole time? Because he feels like he's somebody that is a character.
Yeah, he seemed to be in character. He was actually cool. Very funny. When somebody does something that disgusting and is so matter of fact about it, the irony is great. So he was great. A lot of people were themselves. Gary Busey was himself. Mm-hmm. I ended up calling him Gary Busey because he threatened to beat me up because I was in his sight line when he was doing his interview. So we don't know if it was him acting or it was really Gary Busey, but you like that. You like when you get the real people.
Oh, yeah. You get all the stories and you get the real person out of it. Yeah. Well, up next for you is Skin, A History of Nudity in the Movies. That's coming out on VOD on August 18th. So how do you transition from cult films to talking about nudity in film itself from way back and from silent films to today?
Well, so how that one started is I'm friends with Jim McBride, known as Mr. Skin.
Oh, okay.
And people know the Mr. Skin website where they just show the nudity from movies. And I called him up and I said, has anybody ever done a documentary on you? And he said, yeah, well, I'm doing a book, and yeah, I'm not that interesting. And through our conversation, we came up with the idea to actually do something more serious and actually cover the history of nudity in movies and see just sort of how censorship affected it. So what we really have is we have a history. It's much more of a traditional documentary in that we trace nudity back to the silent era of films. We talk about how the Hays Code censored Hollywood and how Hollywood in the 20s and 30s was debauchery. I mean, it was just crazy. We talk about how filmmakers broke the code, broke censorship. We talk about how the MPAA was formed and how the film directors in the 60s, 70s, and 80s used the rating system. And then we also get into sort of like what is nudity today with the discussion of the Me Too era. So it's not lascivious in that there's plenty of nudity, but it's a much more serious documentary about nudity. And everybody who has seen it so far has said the same thing. They were fascinated because there's so much in there that nobody knows. So it's a little bit educational, it's a little bit titillating, and we're getting a good initial buzz on it. So.
Awesome. Well, that's out on August 18th.
Yeah, and it's called Skin, A History of Nudity in the Movies, not film.
Oh, film. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, once you get past Skin, A History, you'll find it.
Talk to me about that Hays Code, because it was from 1934 to 1968, correct?
Well, the Hays Code sort of broke down before that. By the late 50s, it was pretty much done. But it was because there was so much debauchery in Hollywood that the Hollywood studios were worried that the government was going to shut Hollywood down. So they did a self-censorship board headed by Hays, and it was fostered by the Catholic League. And so the idea was they were going to be the absolute censors of everything that came out. And Joseph Breen became the head of the Hays Commission, and he put his stamp on every single Hollywood release. And there was no nudity, and there was no cursing, and there was nothing lascivious, and there was no hints of anything. And even if there was something sex going off screen, they wanted to make Hollywood prim and proper for everybody. So when you look at the movies up till 1933, there's all kinds of crazy sort of normal kind of raucous stuff, and then you get to like 1933 and on, and it's all kind of buttoned up. But then there were filmmakers who started to break the code, especially filmmakers like Russ Meyer in the late 50s and David Friedman and Doris Wishman, people that started to break the code a little bit, and then sort of all hell broke loose. The code was inert at that point, and then of course came the MPAA rating system, which is a whole other discussion in the movie.
And that's definitely the way that rating system works, and the way you can almost trick it in certain ways, because it's never an actual code, if you will. It's up to one person or several people to judge a film and say, this is the code.
It's actually a board of parents.
Oh.
It's a board of parents, but they're full-time employees of the MPAA.
Okay.
So it's the same board every time. I think it's 12 or something, and they discuss it and they come up with the rating. And they get tricked a lot by filmmakers. There's some cool stories in our film about how the MPAA got tricked, and I'll leave that to people to see the film. But it's
absolutely.
very cool. It's very cool.
Look forward to that. And there's a lot of, as you said, educational purposes, educational things in Skin. But there was one thing in the trailer that caught my eye, was like American Pie's Shannon Elizabeth said after doing American Pie, had she not done that, she wouldn't have really had a career.
There's a lot of discussion amongst actresses on the reasons they did nudity, whether they were forced to do it because they wouldn't have gotten the job if they hadn't, if it helped or hurt their career, how comfortable they were in doing it. And Shannon Elizabeth has embraced it and basically feels like had she hadn't done it, she wouldn't have gotten the role. That was a breakout role for her. That gave her a career. So she embraces it. Other actresses are like, well, I had to do it. I had no choice. I would have rather not done it. I was kind of forced into it. And you sort of get those stories. And they're counterbalanced with how it is today, how people are taking it much more seriously, and people have much more of a choice whether or not they're going to do the nudity. You know, some actresses were tricked into it, or, you know, they said, well, will you do this? And they said, well, that wasn't in my contract. And, well, we'll give you a little more money. And it all happened on the set. And so those days are over, obviously, because it's much more buttoned up now. But those stories are fascinating. They really are.
I'm looking forward to seeing that again. You got so many great people in the film, as I just mentioned, you know, Shannon Elizabeth. You also have like Malcolm McDowell and Kevin Smith in here. What do they offer into the film?
Well, Malcolm McDowell was in the first nude movie that in the United States showed full male penis. So that was the movie If. And he talked about how male nudity, how the inequity of it, how it's always been okay for women to be naked, but it really wasn't always okay for men to be naked. But how today it's much different. And sort of he talked about that period where he sort of got to be naked for the first time, and it changed, helped change everything. Bruce Davison, also an Oscar nominee, he talked about it as well for a movie called Last Summer that he did. So it was kind of interesting to hear men talk about how they thought it was like sort of like normal, you know. It was like, but it was really forbidden here in the United States.
And we do have such a strange belief of nudity on television and film. Over here, no. Violence is okay, but nudity, no. You go anywhere else in the world, they're all about it. They're okay with it. They accept the natural beauty of the human body, it seems.
Yes, and that's also discussed in the film. So you're very observant.
Well, Skin, A History of Nudity in the movies. Got it right this time, right?
That's great. Thank you.
All right. I want to make sure I got it right. Out on VOD on August 18th. And I just want to bring this up because we did talk about it a little bit beforehand, but I was doing a little research on you, but you're one of the masterminds behind the adult video news, the AVNs, long ago. So how did you transition from that career to where you are now?
Yeah, I started AVN out of college in 1983.
Okay.
And created the award show. And the transition really has to do with that award show in that it was on television, first on the Playboy channel, and then we sold it to Showtime. And once Showtime started to run the award show every year, we sort of took it up to another level. And we were able to do bigger, more elaborate shows, and it kind of put us on the map. Because I had that experience with Showtime, when I sold my company in 2010, I was able to transition into doing what I always wanted to do, which was film and TV production. And Showtime gave me a good handful of shows and documentaries to produce for them. So I had a nice little run, and I taught myself how to produce. So then I'm doing this stuff now. So it was really sort of the AVN award show gave me the opportunity to do what I'm doing now, which was always my dream.
That's really cool. COVID-19 has obviously shut down a lot of things. Hollywood, the world itself. How has that affected you in terms of your job or any projects you have coming up?
Well, in March, we had a fully funded documentary ready to go. And we knew it might be tough to start shooting it. And then the money people shut the whole thing down and decided not to fund it. And it wasn't like, okay, well, here's the pre-production money. And when we can shoot, go ahead and shoot. They were like, you know what? We don't know how long this is going to last. We're going to put our money elsewhere. It's fully funded. The contracts were signed. We were ready to go. So that's how people are affected by this. I'm not the only one. Out here, nobody's working. So,
right.
I feel bad for us because it was a cool documentary. And maybe someday we'll be able to put it back together. But it was kind of a bummer,
Absolutely. Well, August 18th. Skin is coming out. We're looking forward to it. VOD, of course, that means, and I assume that means everywhere from Amazon to Apple to every place you can find it, correct?
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I'm sure there's some cable systems that'll not like the title and won't run it, but, it'll be available most places.
All right, Paul, thank you so much for the time today. Stay on the line with me. I'm going to go ahead and pull us off air, but I'll talk to you afterwards. And
all right, great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for checking out Happy Hour Live. Stay tuned for more editions of it coming up. Stay tuned to our Facebook page. And also don't forget, you can check out past episodes over at BelowNo, rock967.com. We'll see you next time.